I'm under the impression that that's not only happening in extractivism. So that has to do also, I think, with the changes in capitalism and the changes in power. And also that makes it much harder to think of how to change it.
So, and also sort of what I respond to, but I want to say one thing, kind of in response to Charlie and the whole thing. I mean, the centrality of race and racism and the collection of whiteness to the capitalist and modernist project is absolutely crucial, right? So in the United States, 1691, Bacon's Rebellion, is when whiteness is first articulated into law, right? And before that, blacks and whites were indentured servants, and actually blacks were preferred because they knew what they were doing in the field, right? But they weren't racialized, like there wasn't, right? And so part of what was done, and this goes with the ontology, is the modernist developmentalist logic, the scientific basis of how the story we told about race, right? There's like, it's a story that has been produced and materialized over time, but that story is integrally linked to the development project, right? In the civilizational view of the world in which they are barbarians and we are civilized, right? And so the part of the reason temporality, I think, for me came out, because I'm not actually someone who worked a lot with that notion, but it's when we look at the modern ontology, and I think Locke's sort of these names three things, it's a very temporal ontology, right? It's based on this idea of moving from a primitive past to a civilized future. It's a division from nature, right? And it's this idea of futurity, right? This idea that futures are coming and it's always better. And race has been integral to building that story and to building that world and to building the way we see that world. And so it's not a coincidence. And so then if we think about the other forms of black suffering that we use, the black suffering that says we need to go help, right? Like Nicholas Kristof's stuff about going to Sudan. And so there are some black suffering bodies that we respond to, especially when they mobilize and, what Mahmoud Mamdani calls the new humanitarian order. They're black suffering bodies that are victims. They're not agents. They're not, they can't be agents. They're objects of our charity, and they're still back in time. So there are suffering black bodies that we treat, right? But they still keep that world, the world that we need to constantly, right? And I think this is part of what Marisol was saying, that the one world view of the world needs to constantly be produced. So what are the practices, and this is from a paper by John Law that is really, what are the practices that produce a one world world? Because it's not just there. There are practices that produce a one world world. And a lot of those practices are discursive, right? And for me, the discourse is material, so it's not. So I just wanted to put that because I think we haven't been clear enough about the centrality of a racialized, the way in which race goes with temporality, right? And so I think that's really, really important. And I guess in terms of how thinking about the knowledge that we produce, right? Because this is something that I think about a lot. And what I wanted to say that Jeff's pointing about the forecasting thing, like I think we need to not fall into assuming that, right? It's uncertain, but it's also recognizing that what is the temporality of knowledge production in the sense of like, do we see ourselves as somewhere outside of and being able to talk about something, or are we part of a networked reality in which the knowledge that we produce that has the potential to get mobilized, right? And so then what is it for? That's why temporality and like the critique of representational, like the work of representation is actually very clear. And the subject-object divide, right, that is also very key to the modern ontology. I think therefore I am, there's a subject and an object, is in a sense that it fits into the temporal scientific way in which we try to describe an object and then see its effects, right? As opposed to realizing that we're coeval with the thing that we're describing. Like the temporality isn't necessarily dividable that way. And so I would say that in that, like my response to what kinds of knowledge we take seriously also has to do with like really taking seriously the critique of science and representation and honoring art and the logic of art and the logic of story, right? So the race, stories can be thought of as fictional, or they can be thought of as like they are what we are told to make the world that it is, right? Race is story, capitalism is a story, like. Yeah, so for me, it's also, like it's doing things, right? And we honestly, I think, often still want to say, as academics, we still want to say, but I'm removing myself and getting like a more truthful picture of the world. And it might be truthful, but it's not necessarily, I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Yeah, it's not an objective positive notion of truth. And it's true to the extent that we're trying to make things happen, right? And then the final thing I'll say is just on the word protest, because one of the words that has been interestingly absent for me, and it's something I've worked with, partly because of just this is the language that people I was talking to were using, is movement, right? Movement. And you could say social movement, but movement in general. And there's a lot of critiques of that word. We can also do the etymology of that one. It's not much older than protest. But it does, when you look at it ontologically, and I want to just put in the table Zibecki's notion of society in movement, which for me has always been really useful as a critique of the social movement, both like social movement as a sociological domain, but also as this object that can be delimited. But what does it mean to create societies in movement, and what does it mean when those happen? And those are moments that happen, and then other things become possible. And in some ways, I think what you're saying about the just intermixing of all these struggles, like I feel like at a much broader level, there is a lot more movement happening right now, and it's not visible or measurable in the sense of less black bodies yet, but ontologically speaking, there's a lot more, things aren't as stable as they were. They're not as shut down.
I want to make a non-horizontal intervention for the moment because our time is running out. And as you suggested, I thought I knew you were. I would suggest that we take hands from people who have sort of summary things that we could take away, and I will begin, even though I'm raising my hand, see? No, I didn't, because I think this is really important in terms of this project and in terms of what's been going on. I fully agree with you, but we have very deliberately not been studying movements in this group. In other words, we are interested in these phenomena that might best be called uprisings, or that we are, in fact, the whole purpose of the project is to interrogate whether or not the way we've thought about movements is appropriate for thinking about whatever is happening today. So in that sense, it's distinct from the last project the two of you were involved in, quite explicitly. The goal is to figure out, we may conclude, and as seems to have been the case, that these ruptures do lead to things that we could call movements, but they lead to things that are not necessarily movements. And sometimes they're just, that's kind of what I was wanting to get at yesterday. Sometimes they're in themselves a practice of power, and that's it, poof. And why should they be anything more necessarily? Why should we expect, what happened in Brazil with all its contradictions of demonstrations within demonstrations within demonstrations, and all the strange stuff that happened in June. It was undoubtedly an event, right, that had enormous consequences, even if some of them are negative in terms of having negative repercussions for the current election, and having in some ways fanned anti-Workers' Party sentiment. So one takeaway is that that what's distinctive about what we're trying to do, I think, is precisely that somehow we're wanting to grapple with things that we're not happy with. We have not been happy with how social movement theory, such as it is, has been able to, or not. So that was just in response. So one takeaway is that, I would say maybe we do want to think about, maybe we want our moment and or event or something to become a permanent nomenclature instead of a conceptual placeholder. I don't know. Because Tahrir moment was originally in the group a conceptual placeholder because we didn't know what to call these things. So we just said, let's call it a Tahrir moment. But maybe, maybe we want to kind of Anyway, no, she's taking stat, so, so they're
Okay, so
concluding hands.
so we're doing the summary
So-
thing.
Yeah, the summary thing, if you would.
Okay, Lasso, is yours fitting into that, or can we do it in the afternoon session?
It wasn't a summary comment, it was a direct response to one of Kevin's questions.
I know, but I think you're.
But we're
Is
summarizing,
that
we're
okay?
summarizing now.
Okay, so, Beth, are you summarizing?
Yeah.
Okay, and then Barbara and George.
No, not me, Paul.
Paul.
Amar, I'm sorry.
Only men summarizing, you guys.
All right, I'll summarize.
Hell yeah.
Yes, I'm under this constraint of summarizing. Okay, one thing which came across is like commonality between protests in Gaza and Ferguson and so on, and there's been a lot of stress on commonalities and tracing some common structural factor like they were trained in the same place, same kinds of weapons were used and so on. But then what I feel is that when we do that, very often we ignore the specificities of each situation, and that has come across in a lot of discussions I've had, and they don't come across in open discussions. Like, for example, in a graduate seminar, everybody would talk of commonality, and once you go for a coffee break, people would say, but what do they say? What does that mean? That's so stupid. And very often I found it, like especially in US grad seminars, you have people from all parts of the world, I've seen it, right? So somebody from Latin America says something, and somebody from some other parts of the world say, but what does that mean? That doesn't, and the problem is that you always refer back to your own context, what happens in your country, and then you try to map that on one movement which happens in Brazil to one movement which happens in Pakistan or India, or one movement which happens somewhere in South Africa. So you try to read and translate it immediately to a context you are familiar with, and in that context it does not make as much sense as it would make in the context of Brazil. And so there's a lot of historical background to it. I found it in Bolivia when I was working like an Indian in Bolivia. Very often, like a lot of these Indianist activists in Bolivia, first of all, they're very happy. They'll say, oh, you're the Indio de verdad. But then, yeah.
A genuine item, right?
And then very often what happened is for a lot of these Indianistas, they saw India as an example of total decolonization. India as a place which has totally thrown out the whites and the Europeans. But then when it comes to India, those are not the major issues. So very often I've had visitors from India, they listen to these people and they say, oh no, this is really problematic, it's really conservative and so on. But then what is conservative in the Indian context would be something very liberating, when we talk about it in Bolivia, because the problems are different, and if you don't know the history and the complexities of history and the trajectories of movements as they develop in these two places, it's really difficult. And even in the US, right now I'm just talking of South Asia and the Andes, but even in other parts I've seen like students from Africa and others from Europe. So there's a lot of inconsistencies and divergences between the way we see each other, and that's mainly because very often we are ignorant of what happens in other regions we are not familiar with. So I think that's also something we need to take into account, because the whole tone I see in these questions is about like constructing a totalizing narrative. There's also a question on
I certainly hope not.
But it also says, or is each best understood with reference to its own particularities. So that's where I would go. We need to understand both the universality and the particularity, and instead of trying to jump to a conclusion.
At some point, I mean, if after everyone has spoken, I think maybe I can frame it in a more summary kind of way.
So I'm just going to name who I have, which is Barbara, Paul, George, Marisol, and now Lasso. And I think that's all we have.
Yes. I'll take over.
Maybe Gustaf first.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I feel more emboldened now that the other South Asian in the room has spoken, and I wanted to say something similar. So we've been talking a lot about temporality and time, and I like when Kevin asked the question, I was reminded of that image of seeing the tear gas canisters, in Gaza and in Ferguson in the same image, And like this kind of gets to like what Zaki was also talking about, like how the temporality of the naked body is sort of kind of superimposed onto the, you know, like in the same moment you can have that happening as Tahrir. Like you can perhaps see both images in two different windows, or you can see it in the same image, and so it's collapsed into one moment. But I think that the question of space is also an important one, and I think that if like it's worthwhile to sort of think of them together. And the reason that I'm saying that is because, I mean, everyone says that, yeah, you know, space and time, but the reason that I'm saying that, I was reminded, like when we were thinking about Gaza and Ferguson together, is in the Western Mass Coalition for Palestine and Ferguson, the protests that happened in Northampton, so the name is Western Mass Coalition for Palestine and Ferguson. There's like no black bodies there. There's very few black bodies there. And in the Springfield No One Leaves protests, which are like anti-eviction protests, there are no, like you don't see the same people who are in Northampton, who are, a lot of like grad students, for instance, go to these protests in Northampton, or a lot of like, you know, the kind of people who live in Northampton. And it's just like the distance is just between Springfield and Northampton, like that's a very small distance, and yet there is this divide. And yeah, so I think that perhaps like bringing back space into the question, like as we think through these questions about time, is also important.
I may be completely blinded by some other work that I'm doing, but I just want to throw this out because I've been hearing it this morning. And that is that possibly what we're looking at is not a time or a space, but something that presupposes both, and it's simply struggle. There's struggle of the security state to enforce a racial order. There's struggle on the part of people in the streets. It's coming from from the local. It's traveling. To me, struggle might capture what it is that we're looking at better than obviously movement, better than protest, better than temporality, better than space. We're not looking somewhere. We're looking at something happening, but it's not only human struggle. It's also non-human forms of struggle. So I would just assert that. Maybe Marisol can fill in for me what that might mean, but that seems like what we're looking at, because some of us are looking at security apparatuses, some of us are looking at movement, some of us are looking at transnational phenomena, some of us are looking very locally, but one thing we're all looking at is struggle. Or we could use something more familiar perhaps to everyone here, and that's Anna Singh's conception of friction. Maybe what we're looking at is friction, and what she's able to do with that concept is designate a level of analysis that isn't spatial or temporal. I mean, it's a really kind of a magic thing that somebody has invented a new level of analysis. I'm completely smitten with it. I don't know about other people, but I'm completely smitten with it. So maybe friction or struggle as a umbrella.
Struggle as an umbrella.
Or friction, either one.
Or friction.
Yeah, this is a fascinating conversation. I'm really glad that in the discussions of Ferguson, we started to move towards discussing the security state, the racial state, and I think that this conversation now that we're moving to in the summary stage about what is a proper term around which to group ourselves is interesting, but on the other hand, it takes us into a level of abstraction and out of a kind of normative political space, which I think is kind of obviously something that we share. And I just want to point to a shift that happened during this conversation, which I thought was really useful. I think whether we pick the word moment, whether we pick the word protest or movement, we're focusing on a kind of vitalist dynamic notion of there's a particular momentary, especially dynamic, agential moment, which is confronting something that is in static and dead, that basically is the state. And I think that is, again, as I kind of brought up last night, we're never going to find the perfect term if we're still understanding that there's something that is dynamic, which is confronting the state. I mean, this is still a liberal, in my view, high modernist frame in which all these terms that we're tossing around are still caught in the dynamic kind of vitalist framing. However, if we start to look at the racial state, the prison state, the security state, the apparatuses of the state as moving, dynamic, socially constituted, internally contradictory, formed of articulated blocks that are constantly insecure and collapsing on each other and having to be reconstituted by violence, but then we mythically reconstituted as internally coherent and a big monolith that we're throwing our heads against, and we're the dynamic ones, and it's the dead thing that's continuous and it's colonial and it's always the same. But I think there's something strategically really interesting about focusing on the frictions and the contradictions and the movements and the moments of rupture within the constitution of the block that we mistakenly call the state, as if it's static, as if it's a one thing. So I think that that's what came up in Ferguson, in our discussion of Ferguson, is interesting, is, you know, moving beyond the notion of ontology being something that's static in the state, and, you know, God forbid we use the Derridian hauntology with an H, or, you know, we start to talk more about not structures of state ontology, but politics and social formations that, you know, my notion of the human security state is that it is actually the most dynamic, contentious, and internally fraught product and formation of social movements who, by definition, need to form violent and expressively punishing linkages with each other in order to remain coherent. So the state, in its the most violent security state form, which we usually think of the most monolithic, is in fact the least monolithic and incredibly violently held together formation. So, as product of what we usually call social movement. So I think moving to looking at, again, the state as products of moments of uprising and social movements, and also looking at the bad guys as social movements and protesters and actors, looking at extermination movements, at punishment movements, and how that is imminently, of course, a racial project. The explosion in racial exterminations in Brazil comes from the mid to late 1980s. Of course, it reflects deeper sort of continuities. The explosion of prison construction in the United States comes from the mid to the late 1980s. I mean, it's a new set of punishment and extermination movements that are masked as the persistence of structural racism, but they're very new, which is kind of a good thing, because it means you can find out how they came about, who's responsible, and like kick their ass. So I think, again, like resisting finding the right term captures the dynamism in the sexiest way, but then leaves the state over there somewhere is something we need to keep thinking about.
Threw me off.
Summarize
Same
that,
thing,
baby.
no, no, so this is something before what I was going to say. I mean, I think that's true, right? This is new. It's also a very continuous, it's like the latest repertoire in response to, right? You know, it's in the same way that the police emerge as a response to the liberation of black bodies from slavery, in the same way that, you know, once the state has become a site of perceived benefits for people of color, whites abandon it and turn instead to incarcerating those people and locking them up in response to civil rights movement. So it's continuity too. But what I want to say is, before we finish on the Ferguson stuff, is kind of draw back this question of ontology, which I think is a central question, and to kind of concretize what it would mean. And to look at it from kind of a decolonial, but more specifically a Fanonian perspective, you know, coloniality and white supremacy are intensely ontological. They're ontological projects that create and mark certain bodies as disqualified from full humanity, as exterminable, as subject to violence, but also as inherently violent. And I think this has serious implications for how we look at these questions of protests eventually. So if we look at things like Ferguson or like Trayvon Martin or like Oscar Grant, we see this played out perfectly in the sense that it's not only the case that people are killed, but it's the case that an entire machinery then enters into motion to disqualify them from having been a victim in the first place. To say they deserved it in a certain way, they had marijuana in their blood, they maybe stole something, but even they probably didn't. And this is, when you look at the way this machinery operates, you begin to realize this is really a systemic thing, right? You know, the disqualification of certain people from the status of human or of deserving of even legal equality. And the implications, I think, for this are significant both in the demands that we make, you know, there was a lot of talk about stand your ground law in Florida, which I'm no fan of stand your ground law, but the question wasn't about stand your ground law, because there are certain people who can stand their ground, and there are certain people who can't. And if you're in the people who can't, it doesn't matter what the law says, you can still get. And if you're Marissa Alexander, you can stand your ground and you'll be possibly facing 20 years, although I guess that was just overthrown. So, if you're John Crawford in a Walmart in an open carry state, not only can you not open carry an automatic rifle, because you're not a white subject, but you can't even pick up a toy rifle off the shelf without being shot dead, and have no charges, pressed. And so this question of, if it's a question of ontology, we need to orient our demands in different ways. But it also has implications for protest, right? Because not only is, Trayvon Martin's appearance in a certain neighborhood was violent, right? And this is why he was then subject to violence. John Crawford's appearance in a Walmart was violent. And so not only is it the case that black protest is coded as violent, which it is, but black appearance is fundamentally coded as violence. And so then how do we understand protest? If we mark out protest as a kind of unifying theme, we have to understand that there are certain subjects that can protest in certain ways, and certain subjects that, when they protest, are, it's already looting, it's already violent, it's already irrational, and all these things, and then therefore kind of subject to violence in general.
I don't know I don't know how, I'm just thinking, I'm going to be thinking out loud, so I don't know how this is going to come out. I'm thinking from what Sonia said, and from one of my obsessions, which is, and it's going to sound like I am going to be talking in pairs, but it's not going to be binaries, because each of these components of the pairs is incomplete without the other. So it's not a binary that's either or, it's both and. So the obsession that I'm going to be talking with is that one between the one that I can express as one world, many worlds, and that I have heard here repeatedly. For example, when somebody said, I don't remember who said it, gas canisters in Gaza and in Ferguson, that's a one world, many worlds at the same time, right? One world, gas canisters, Gaza, Ferguson, many worlds. And in Gaza, many worlds, and one world, Ferguson, one world, many worlds. So I think this one world, many world tension, I think I've been hearing it frequently. And then the other obsession of mine is eventualizing, as you're thinking, eventualizing the one world, to be able to see how it's being made, to be able to see Gaza, Ferguson, gas canisters, both as one world, many worlds. And then the other obsession is when we say state, we're also saying access to the state. The state is, yes, the state is incomplete, but it's not incomplete because it is incomplete. It itself is not complete, but because there are excesses to it that it cannot know. So, and perhaps looking at that tension, friction, we can also see one world, many worlds. But these things do not necessarily overlap, so the state is not necessarily the one world, it can also be the many worlds. So these couples are not binaries because they are incomplete without each other, and because they are not fitting into, they are not made to scale. So the state and the one world do not have the same scale. And the many worlds is not necessarily without state, and the many worlds doesn't necessarily represent an access to the state. So I'm not trying to make pairs that overlap. I'm just trying to make it, to talk about what we've been talking about, avoiding binaries, which means avoiding units. And for example, when Margaret was naming all those names, of all those bodies. Those names that sound to us like units are not units. They are an entanglement of them. So,
That was my list. Unless I'm totally blank.
Good.
Can we solve all those issues?
Can I just a quick comment? Because as I hear all these comments on Ferguson, I think maybe we have also to introduce another word that I feel missing here, is insurgency. Because how do you respond to state terror, right? The conversation about terror that somebody brought yesterday. So if what we said yesterday makes sense, if these ontological impossibilities make sense, so we have to find another way outside of the traditional sphere of what we consider as politics, right? As Saidiya Hartman is called, the closure of politics, right? Or the only way to face state terror is somewhere else beside the public sphere, beside the traditional protest, beside the exercise of what we call political subjectivity. We have to redefine this in another way. In some way, I think this emulation of people, self-immolation or black criminality, all these are ways to bring about in another way that we can conceptualize the political practice in space that there is no way to bring to be heard within this traditional sphere of the politics. So maybe always I have to think about this transgressive practice outside of the operation.
Well,
Yeah.
well,
No, just to topic. It's very interesting because the slogan that we can see repeatedly in the protests, they don't represent us. For me, it's not they want to be represented by other representational system, but it's impossible to be represented. I think this is the message.
Yeah.
It's impossible
Yeah.
to represent.
and that's part of what
Yeah.
back to the,
It's
there's
something
something
impossible.
going on,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I talk about this stuff as in my class and otherwise as sort of civil society's other. You know, I mean, this is definitely not civil society, and it's definitely not you know, and what you're talking about, and what's happening in Ferguson is not about civil society,
Social
sort of,
movement.
you know,
Yeah.
or sort of, you know, sort of making demands on the state, and it's just, it really is civil society's other.
We don't have to find one word we can say about insurrection, dissidence,
Sure, right,
uprising.
it's just a heuristic
transgressive.
exercise.
I mean,
No
we have
one's,
many
no
words
one's
for that.
wanting to stick with one word, it's
Yeah,
just a
yeah.
heuristic exercise of what, you know, how to move forward, so that, yeah.
Can I just add something to this? I think we should also be careful when we are trying to find the civil society's other. How this other was produced also, and what kind of regimes
Good.
are producing the subject of nudity or the subject of, you know, their self-representation. Because we have a tendency to think, or I have a tendency to think, that when each time I'm thinking about dissent and transgression, I'm really thinking about something that is against a certain regimes, you know, political regimes, economic regimes, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so some of these subjects are not necessarily the anti-capitalist regimes that we are looking, you know, we might be excited at finding. So how do we then do that? And this is why I'm thinking it's very important to keep in mind that we are talking about multiple registers and different registers of what's taking place. So it's not a unitary subject of transgression or transgressive politics. It's multiple subjects that are transgressive in their own ways, but they're not necessarily transgressive in the same way, doing the same work, coming from the same, being the product of the same regimes. And this is what I am having trouble with, and I'm going to talk about very briefly where I'm coming from. I started a project on hip hop and youth cultural politics in Morocco because before 2010, because I really felt like something was going on there, like a true revolution is going on there. If you read the lyrics, if you see the spaces that they have created, if you see the massive involvement of youth in the movement, in that movement, I was thinking, well, revolution is coming from within that movement. When we started to have the uprising in the Middle East, the main rappers in Morocco who are now internationally known haven't been involved in it and even criticized it on the internet and chanted against it. So, and these are the rappers I was really following closely, thinking that these people are having a political message. I went back after 2010 and I spoke to them. So I talked to them before. I said, what's going on here? When you look at the lyrics, they are really describing and pointing to every single space. There isn't one space of state domination that they did not point to and denounced. And they say, no, we don't do politics. This was a social critique. That's not a political project. We are artists. And so how do you understand that? Like, do we tell them, no way, you are a political subject? And they say, no, we are not. Really, how do you do this? And of course, there are a few rappers who have been supportive of the movement, but the mass movement, when you talk about those who are in the streets, at least in the case of Morocco, they tell you, yes, we have been listening to that, we are the hip-hop generation. So we need to find a way in which we connect those messages coming from a group of people, or a large group of people who do not consider themselves as political actors. They were doing social critique. And those who actually were not necessarily artists, but they were following that, and they were the term fear was thrown here earlier by somebody, and I think that's to me that's the connection. The connection is that the way in which rap, at least in the case of in many places, in which the way in which rap domesticated the feeling of fear. So fear is no longer that thing that really makes you tremble. Fear is something that you chant, you throw out there in rap, lyrics, to the point that people are not fearful subjects anymore. They are out there and they tell you, we don't fear the state. We know that we are going to be beaten up, but we'll be out anyway. So I'm just thinking loudly, as you said, but I think it's important to keep in mind these various levels and registers of dissent, whatever.
Alex, you have to. This would be the last moment, and then I want to say something about moving on. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know in the world that I come from, the qualifier of political action is one that's, when you're an artist, you write a political artist or a political artist/activist. So I was going to suggest activism, like what happened to activism, did the Supreme Court steal it? And so aren't these all just forms of political activism or political actions? But then it complicates it if people don't consider themselves actually acting or acting politically. So it's just a question.
No. Good. Well, we have a lot of material here to systematize, and we are going to call on the facilitators to help us in the future here at UMass to systematize this material that we've collected here on tape. But what invariably happens in these sessions is that our questions lead to different questions. But that's what good scholarship is all about, I think. The people who are catering this event are operating on a temporality all their own, and so for some reason the lunch has already arrived. So we could, eat now, and then keep working. Well, we could take a brief. It'll take a while to get the food and come back to our seats, given how many of us there are. It's right here. This is it. And some were concerned about, but anyway, yeah, it's here.
We have to turn up the heat, please.
It's not.
I'm sure that we
Can we burn
no,
something?
I'm sure that
Set up a bonfire in here.
they thought it was a protest,
but they were just trying to keep warm.
Wrangling books around the corner.
Another burn the economist.
You know, I use